So obviously AI transparency has been an issue for a long time now. Why has the generative AI boom caused such an upheaval and a massive acceleration to regulate and make these technologies more transparent?
Sure. Um, think about AI. It's a very broad term. Unfortunately, it's one of those terms that people throw around without a real definition of it. Um, Artificial intelligence, the way the term is used is for one type of AI called machine learning. That's about 80% of what's out there. Machine learning has been around for a long, long time. And in fact, even back when I was your age, credit scores developed by what's now called FICO, but the company used to be called Fair Isaac, were generated by machine learning. So that's, a long time ago. I don't want to go to exactly my age, but so machine learning has been around for 30 plus years, probably 40 years, and in some level of production, not just in universities labs. Um, but generative AI is much newer, and I think once ChatGPT launched and with a broad swath of the country or the world saw generative AI and the power of it, I think that's what brought home, wow, this is super powerful and in the same way concerning. And if you combine that with the fact that there's been a 15 to 20-year experiment with policymakers of not legislating social media. They really kind of sat on their hands and said, I really hope that big tech does the right thing here. I really hope Mark Zuckerberg will take good care of my kids. That has been an abject failure. And your generation, my kids' generation, I've got kids 18, 20, and 22, are paying for that lack of uh, policy involvement in terms of increased anxiety levels, increased depression levels, increased suicide rates in the worst case, um, very much correlated to social media usage. And the social media companies had the data 10 to 15 years ago, and they just kept driving more and more engagement, more and more eyeballs, more and more thumbs up or thumbs down. And so I think regulators and policymakers now are recognizing we can't sit around and hope that these technologists are going to do the right thing. They won't. They will only act in their interests.
So you bring up a good kind of parallel with social media not being kind of regulated in any meaningful sense. And so I guess the question is, why wasn't social media regulated from the get-go? Was it just like this unique thing that we didn't really understand, so we would think, oh, maybe it'll just regulate itself, maybe it'll taper out? Was there just lots of lobbying? Was it all of the above, or was there something else going on?
I think in the early years, first of all, Facebook launched in 2004 before even a smartphone. Smartphone came out in 2007. Okay, so this is the days of flip phones. No one could get access to the internet on their phone, that sort of thing. So social media was kind of an interesting thing through 2010 or 2011. It was like a way, my generation reconnected with old high school friends or something like that. And then, as it got more and more integrated in people's lives and in society in kind of the 2011, 2012 through, let's say, 2016, 2017 timeframe, politics got on there a lot. There was a lot of advertising on there for politics. There was disinformation campaigns from the Russians. There was all sorts of things going on in that time frame as the scale really took off and smartphone usage took off in parallel to it. I think at that point it accelerated so fast that it caught a lot of people just off guard. They just didn't realize how fast it was growing around them. Certainly, the social media companies knew themselves because they had all the data. But I don't think policymakers were really used to it because to them, it had that original kind of branding of, oh, this is kind of a nice homey thing to connect with, old high school classmates or, my old flame from back when or something like that.
Yeah, we misunderstood the monster in that
Yeah.
way.
Yes.
Um, Silly
And,
question,
and
but
then, by the way,
yep.
by the time it got big in 2017, 2018, Meta sorry about that. Meta and others are fighting. They have fought tooth and nail against regulation at both the federal and state levels with huge lobbyists, and you can't imagine the amount of money going into fighting legislation from start with Meta, but Google, whatever. Which is why we don't have a national privacy law, for instance, which is to me shocking. Um, just to start there.
Can you say more about the national privacy law? A lot of Gen Z, unfortunately or not, they don't really care about privacy. And that's one of the things that a lot of people in cybersecurity, for example, they're just like, you guys need to start caring about your data on the internet. We're seeing kind of the repercussions of when you just leave data on the internet, AI scrapers come in and use them. So why is a national privacy law even in the conversation? Why do we need that?
Okay, so let's just start with something basic, which is healthcare. Healthcare has a law called HIPAA, Health Information. I don't know what HIPAA stands for, HIPPA. You should probably look it up until you're, but everyone knows it's HIPAA, and everyone thinks their healthcare data is protected. And HIPAA came from, you know, basically back before there was HIPAA laws, you know, back 15 years ago, like people would be blackmailed on for, you know, hey, you had a mental breakdown, you were in a mental institution so and so long ago, and I'm going to tell the world or tell your employer or whatever unless you pay me this, or you know, there was those sorts of things. People were being barred from jobs for past, you know, attending Alcoholics Anonymous or those sorts of things, which is why healthcare information, especially like mental health, became a part of HIPAA laws. Okay. So today, um, people think that their healthcare information is protected from privacy laws. In the world of generative AI, it is not. Okay. Because HIPAA only applies to hospitals and health insurance organizations. All right.
Mm.
So, anybody who uses Google Maps, for instance, Google Maps is taking a snapshot of where you are every 6 minutes, and you can go online and find it all the way back. All right. So, the first thing is your data is not anonymized. Google or Meta will say your data is anonymized, but it's really not. Why? Because um, generative AI is really good at taking like, okay, Ayush is he at this location every night between, you know, 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. That's clearly his house or his apartment. So now we know who he is, or we can triangulate very quickly who he is, and then we can map it over with his LinkedIn contacts or his friends on Instagram. And now, you know, very quickly your name comes up, right? In terms of the Venn diagram crossover of two or three things. So now we know who you are. Now, if you went to a mental health institution and were there for, you know, some period of time or visited there every week, Google Maps knows you were there, and hence you're tracked there. All right. If you went to visit or you're an ailing parent or sister or whatever in the same situation, your map there, you know, if you went to if you or someone you know went to an abortion clinic, all of that privacy is not protected by HIPAA anymore because it's on Google. It's not on a health insurance provider. So if you just start there, you know, as an example, Google location information is now being subpoenaed in certain states for things like visiting abortion clinics. So I really believe that your generation should care a lot about privacy. The other thing that happens is all of us were 20 at one point. You know, I was in the Navy for 5 years on active duty as a submarine officer between 21 and 27, you know. And when I was a sailor, I was a sailor, you know. I swore like a sailor, I drank like a sailor. And I don't necessarily want everything I did as a sailor at age 25 to be um, public information here 30 years later. I'm not saying I did anything I'm embarrassed about, but like, you know, you do stuff when you're 25 and you're under a lot of pressure driving a nuclear submarine, you probably, you know, wouldn't do 30 years later as a parent, right? So those are the types of things that I think everybody should care more about their privacy. The other thing is beyond your generation, kids, they're getting posted, you know, their parents are posting videos, clips of their voices. All of this stuff can be replicated now on Gen AI. So this is where, privacy gets really concerning.
Yeah, I think we will come back to the kids being posted online and not just their voices, but other things are being created
Images,
of
yeah,
them.
right.
And but we'll get to that. One of the problems that I see with what you're saying, I just want to push back a little bit because there
Sure.
is a lot of friction with Gen Z and privacy. Because when you're saying Google Maps is tracking me. It knows when I'm at my apartment. It knows when I'm taking a friend to the abortion clinic, et cetera, et cetera. The immediate reaction that I see from most Gen Z is I don't care. This will not, like, them knowing my location will never be used against me. It can't. They cannot fathom it. And this is one of the problems with explaining to the generation, yes, but it may be used against you in the future. It may be used to alter your behavior, subtly, but in the future drastically. And further, all the things that they're posting on social media, whether it's politically related or not, that will be recorded and used against them in the future. And so I guess it's a recapitulation of the previous question, but how do we get Gen Z to care about their privacy? Like, what do we say to them to really like put that very blunt, abrasive message in their heads of you need to control what you're doing online. You need to keep as much of your life private as possible because these things do happen and they will happen to you.
Yeah. I mean, uh, it is part of the human condition, whether you're Gen Z or my age, to spend more time thinking about kind of an immediate feedback loop of what feels good or what's fun tomorrow or whatever than what might be an issue 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So that's not unique to that's not unique to your generation. But I would just say that um, there are an uncountable number of scenarios in the next 5 to 15 years where private things are not private at all
Hmm.
and are used in very negative ways. The most basic of which is you're in an interview, and it's maybe not an interview for your first job or for, you know, uh, uh, waiting tables or working hourly, for the Department of Transportation or whatever, where there's not a super deep interview process besides, can you do the basics things and can you show up on time? But, 10 years later, you're trying for your first management position or something, and someone is almost for sure going to do a little basic search on you. Like, you know what I mean? And something comes up that's a video that you're in, that you're doing something you don't want to be doing, it really doesn't reflect well on you for that job, even though it was fun at the time, and it really shouldn't be online anymore, or you should have opted in, you should have been allowed to at least opt in to that being kept online, right? But we're at least a big believer in opt-in requirements for generative AI using data. That's one of our kind of core premises is you should at least you should be asked whether you want your training data, your private information to be used in training data, because once it's in training data, it can be used in all sorts of ways you never dreamt of. Okay. And including, mimicking you, creating something that's sent to someone you don't want it to be sent to, that talks like you, and including someone calling your parents and having an image or a likeness of you that talks and basically says you're under duress and you need to pay this ransom. You're begging your parents to pay this ransom. I mean, these things are going on and they're being used by generative AI that has access to all this data, and at least you should have opted into that as opposed to just Google taking it. But here's a real simple, my definition of opt out versus opt in. I got my phone here. It rang because I didn't turn the ringer off a minute ago. But I got my phone here, and you and I are sitting next to each other at the coffee shop, and I get up to go to the restroom, and you don't know me. You're just sitting next to me, right? And I leave my phone there, and opt out, which is what the big tech companies all use for privacy, is opt out is like you look at that phone and go, I wouldn't mind having that phone, and he didn't tell me not to take it. So I'm just going to take his phone. All right. And that wouldn't fly. You know what I'm saying? But that's exactly what all the tech companies are doing with opt out. Opt in is you say, hey, Rob, hey, mister, you're going to the restroom. Do you mind? I actually need to make a call or want to, do a quick search. I don't have access to a browser. Can I use your phone for a minute while you're in the restroom? And I opt in to you using my phone instead of you just taking it. So it's a real simple way to think about it, and I think most people would want anything that's being used by some big company to they would should be able to opt into that as opposed to that big company taking everything from them.
Yeah, no, I think that that description of opt-in versus opt-out is a very neat and tidy picture of precisely what's going on. It doesn't feel, again, being digital natives, it doesn't feel like every time we're searching or every time we're using ChatGPT or something that we're giving loads of information for free that may be used against us. But that is precisely what is happening. So, turning from social media regulation and privacy towards generative AI,
Mhm.
before we go into the AI Transparency Coalition,
Yep.
why did you even start on this journey? I know we just talked about it before, but do I know you're not Gen Z, you're not a millennial, but do the worldly generations, the one with more experience and wisdom of how this world works, do they care as much about AI transparency as maybe the millennials and Gen Z and maybe Gen Alpha should? Or like, what is your philosophy on this or mindset?
Yeah. Well, let me give you just a little background. I mentioned I'm an engineer by training. I'm a mechanical engineer, really. I did some coding in college. I haven't really done any since. As I mentioned, I was a submarine. I joined the Navy. I was a submarine officer on active duty for 5 years. So I went through a pretty hefty 2 year what's called the nuclear training pipeline. And the Navy did a lot of what certainly master's level engineering around learning to operate a nuclear power plant and all the systems supporting it. Um, and then I went back to grad school. And after grad school, I did an MBA and a master's in manufacturing systems. And after that, I spent almost 30 years in technology, initially in enterprise sales, but I've been a four-time CEO of small to medium-sized businesses. I co-founded one and ran it for 7 years, and raised between 2001 and 2007, raised $27 million of financing across 5 equity rounds. That doesn't relative to what's being raised today doesn't sound like that much, but that was a lot of money. And, I'd have a hairline to show for it. Pulmonary system that's twice as old as my body age, which is already too old. And that just didn't work, and I had to shut it down. I did another small one that's more like 10 people, and the founder just ended up needing to run that himself at the end, and so I just let him take it back. I was asked by a board and some investors to come into one where four VPs had resigned inside of a month, and I ran that for a couple of years. It was a turnaround, it really didn't work. We didn't really get it turned around. And then there was one I ran for about 10 years, and it was acquired by MasterCard. And that was acquired in June of 2021, and I had a 2 year requirement to help integrate it into MasterCard up till last summer. That business was in um, online identity verification. So really, is this Ayush checking out, buying something? All of the big e-commerce companies were customers of ours, Amazon and Apple and Target and on down the line, and a lot of big banks, a number of the crypto companies at the time. Buy now, pay later, like Afterpay or whatever. You see all these offers when you're buying stuff to pay over 4 months or 6 months. They were all customers because people had to sign up for accounts and then use them for transactions. And we use name, address, phone, email, and IP address to try and triangulate on, is this Ayush or is this a fraudster out of Russia or somewhere in Africa or whatever, that or China, that state sponsored or someplace without a lot of strong laws, that is um, bought 10,000 credit card numbers on the dark web, including yours, Ayush, and is using them as fast as they can to do transactions before you look at your credit card statement and it pops that this wasn't my transaction, you turn your credit card off. Okay. So we were giving, and the core of what we did was machine learning, which again, is, back to earlier on, is predictive AI. So machine learning is trying to make a prediction of an outcome based on inputs. Okay. And the inputs we had were name, address, phone, email, and IP, because that's what's in your shopping cart checkout online, and a bunch of additional data attributes like how long your email address has been on the network, right? Is it brand new, or do we see it in a transaction 5 years ago? Okay. Because obviously a new, you can create email addresses really quickly. So a new email address is higher risk. Is your phone number a Google Voice number, block of numbers that go to that were used by Google Voice, which is easy to replicate, or is it a landline with a landline, or a cell number with a block that T-Mobile has, or Verizon has? And we used, so there were about 50 data attributes we used, um, and we came out with a score for our customers of 0 to 500. Less than 125 was almost for sure Ayush. North of about 375 was almost for sure fraud. And there was a gray area in there. So again, we're using a score with cut points in it to make a prediction. And our customers use that prediction to help decide if they were going to accept or reject the transaction right at the time. We had to give that score within about a third of a second, 300 milliseconds or something like that. Okay. So, uh, the key to your how accurate our predictions were the training data we used. And our training data was what was called chargebacks. Okay. So a chargeback is you look at your credit card statement, whether it's online or mailed to you, and you see, like, hey, I didn't buy this first class one-way ticket to London last week that was $5,000. And so you call your credit card company and you say, I didn't do this transaction, and your credit card company says, Ayush, your credit card number was compromised. We're going to turn that credit card number off. We'll take care of that fraudulent transaction, and we'll issue you a new credit card number. And so that transaction gets registered as a chargeback, which is highly correlated to fraud. Okay. There's also something called friendly fraud, which your generation will know well, which is you look at your credit card transaction, you're like, oh crap, I didn't really want to buy those 15 Fortnite skins, last night in the heat of battle, and I don't really want to pay for them. So I call my credit card company and say, and please don't do that, but this happens. It's friendly. It's called friendly fraud. Someone stole my credit card number and bought 15 Fortnite skins. They're like, yeah, right. But anyway, long and short is chargebacks were what we used for training data. And it was hard to get chargebacks because there's about a 45-day lag generally, between 30 to 45 days between the transaction time and when you get your credit card statement, and this feedback loop happens. So our customers that gave us the training data had to give us a transaction number up front when the transaction happened, so we could trace it back to whether it ultimately was a chargeback or not. And then we used, and so less 4 or 5% of our customers we worked really closely with to put that infrastructure in place to get chargeback data. And that data was what we use to generate our scores between 0 to 500. Because what the machine learning does is it looks and says, oh, this was a fraudulent transaction. What were the name, address, email, IP um, uh, data elements up front that led to that? And it learns basically what the pattern up front is that is likely to be a chargeback, and what the pattern of a combination of elements, data elements, and attributes up front that's likely to be a good transaction. That's what machine learning is. And so how precise our scores were, how accurate, we were at 450 that this is definitely fraudulent, was only as good as our training data. And that came through in spades when we opened an office in Amsterdam, because you go, because our training data was in the US, and then you go over to Europe, and Europe has different privacy laws. So it's got less information in the checkout because of privacy laws there. And it's got different payment methods, frankly, more secure payment methods. And so there's different fraud patterns in Europe. So we needed to get chargeback data from our customers, training data from our customers in Europe, to have relevant scores in Europe. We opened an office in Singapore. We need to work with our Southeast Asia customers in Singapore to get accurate training data in Southeast Asia, to have precision in our scores. And that's why MasterCard acquired us, really, is we had accurate scores around the world. We are just a little 250 person company. MasterCard's, you know, 20,000 employees. We still had more accurate scores because we worked so hard on doing that. Um, and so in our little niche, we were really good at that. And what we did was we curated training data. So the big takeaway to your listeners is in machine learning, you pay very close attention to training data because there's a feedback loop from the training data you use and how precise or accurate your outcome, your prediction is at the end. Okay. Now, if you take and I spend a lot of time briefing staffers uh, and legislators, elected officials on this. Um, Whether it's machine learning or generative AI, it's just a system, and a system has inputs and outputs. Okay, and so the three inputs are the same for both. There is basically a model, and it doesn't really matter what the model is, but in machine learning, it's a data model, and there's a bunch of different flavors. And in generative AI, there's a large language model, but both of them, they're open sourced. Facebook open sourced all their large language models because they were behind. So you or I could download a 95th percentile model, very cutting edge. Okay, large language model. The second input is compute power. And compute power is basically infinite because of Azure or AWS or whatever. The only other input is training data. And so in machine learning, we spent all of this time curating the training data. And when I started looking just briefly at what was going on in generative AI, there was no curation of training data. They were sucking in everything digitized, books, Reddit chats, anything on social media, any image you could get your hands on, copyrighted information, personal information. When I say personal information, I'm not talking about PII. That's like less than 1% of it, but every video that's been posted, that sort of thing, every song. And so the training data wasn't curated. So what happens when the training data is not curated? And I know this is a long answer to your question, but what happens when the training data is not curated is you lose control of the outputs. So what was going on last summer? A chat GPT session tells a guy to commit suicide, and he does. Okay. And OpenAI says that's a quote unquote hallucination, which is a really innocuous term that was made up to take away any accountability for the fact that their chat box, this is documented, their chat session told this guy to commit suicide. All right. That is not a hallucination. That's a loss of control of training data because generative AI is just a giant pattern matching system. It takes chats or books or thing it's seen in its memory from training data, and it maps it to the discussion that's happening now. All right. So somewhere in some sketchy, Reddit chat room or something, it saw something in its memory that told someone to commit suicide, and it mapped it to that chat. And OpenAI doesn't know where it is. Okay. They lost control of their training data because they're just taking in mountains of it. Okay. Another documented case, a chat GPT session tells a 13-year-old girl she should be okay with sexual exploitation. Documented. All right. That is not a hallucination. That is a loss of control of training data and zero accountability to what's going on in these systems. And so when you have such a giant volume of training data, you lose control of the outputs and you can't trust the system. And so what I got concerned with last summer is we are losing control of these systems at very early stages, and we've got 3 billion people connected to these systems. I mean, Meta and Google and Apple in their own way, and Microsoft all have 2 to 3 billion people at their fingertips connected to their systems. So, Meta can run a beta test on 3 billion people around the world. That concentration of power should be concerning to anyone. And when you have that kind of concentration of power and you have a loss of control of training data, it's a very concerning scenario that I got concerned about. And I came at it with 15 years of social media background. And I immediately said, the big tech companies will not do the right thing under any circumstances. They will not look out for the citizens of this country or the world. They will look out for their best interest, full stop. So it has to be regulated. So that's a long story of a little bit of background on where my knowledge came in. I don't profess to be an expert in generative AI, but where my knowledge came into this, why I got concerned, why Transparency Coalition is focused on training data.
It's a necessary story, and the examples that you gave ring just unfortunately, they're just dreadful examples. So when we're talking about regulation, so we're talking about transparency, we need to first understand what transparency is. But
Yep.
just so we can framework this, regulation is not trying to make sure that generative AI doesn't become like conscious or whatever people are afraid of. This is a more grounded, more realistic.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of scary scenarios out there, and I could get a lot of concerned about them. We're focused on harms that are happening now to the population now. We're and so that's our focus of regulation. The other thing is just to get the muscle of regulation. It's a flabby muscle. It hasn't been exercised. It didn't get exercised at all in 15 years of social media. So we need to get our elected officials to have a mindset towards being okay to regulate things, not killing innovation, which is what you'll hear from the
Mhm.
tech lobby. But there's going to be tons of innovation in this area. We're not trying to put a genie back in the bottle. We are trying to put some basic guardrails in place with some enforceability around those guardrails, such that um, uh, uh, the tech organizations running these largest, what are called foundational models, take into account the safety and security of our citizens, take into account IP and copyright laws for our writers and our singers and our songwriters and our script writers and so forth. Those are the sorts of things we care about.
Yeah, no, people that always shout Luddite whenever people talk about regulation, I think are very silly. Again, you're not trying to kill or stifle innovation. You're offering seatbelts to cars,
That's exactly right. Yeah.
which frankly, it's interesting as an aside that the automobile industry lobbied against seatbelts in cars back in the day. So, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme.
Yep.
AI transparency. Why Again, simple question that I know you'll hit out of the park. Why do we need AI transparency? And first of all, what is transparency? So when we're looking at an LLM, an artificial neural network, we cannot see what is inside. So AI transparency, explainable AI, what are these things and how should we think about them?
Yeah. So I'm trying to find really quickly. So here's a definition of transparency that I really like, and it's from instead of just pulling out a definition from wherever I wanted. This is a definition from what's called a language of trustworthy AI, an in-depth glossary of terms that was created by the National Institute of Standards. So okay, so this is a real standards body that a lot of companies participate in, and their definition of transparency is the property of a system or process to imply openness and accountability. Okay. And if you were to ask me why I started this, it's because I don't see any openness and I don't see any accountability for the reasons I just gave in my examples from the largest foundational model owner, generative AI model owners. And so, if nothing else, um, our our citizens broadly in this country and in the world deserve openness and accountability on a technology as powerful as this.
Roger that. What are your solutions for this? So again, we're not trying to stifle innovation. We're just
Yep.
offering seatbelts. This is
Yep.
again not going to um, this letter calling for a halt in AI development. I think is
Yeah.
over
Spit
there.
into the wind. That's not
I
going to
don't.
happen. Yeah.
I don't think that is relevant for this context. So you have
Yep.
five solutions that I wrote down. I'm sure we can go into the sub-solutions. We have enforcing existing laws at the federal and state level, require transparent licensing of data, establishing a data declaration of AI models, making opt-in the industry standard. We already touched on that
I've
one.
done that.
Building a scalable regulatory structure for AI.
So let's start with, just if we step back, this an AI system. One of the things that you're trying to do in this podcast, and I applaud you for it broadly, not just with me, but broadly, is to your listeners make AI understandable. That's one of the things Transparency Coalition, me and my co-founder Jay Geisma and our team are trying to do with policymakers, elected officials, and staffers, and enforcement officials like attorneys general's offices and so forth. We're trying to make AI understandable, and we're really fighting back on this tech lobby narrative of, hey, Ayush, Rob, this is like a magic box. You guys will never understand it. Step back, we'll take it from here. Like, that is an absolutely false narrative. And it's not a helpful narrative for something that's going to touch all parts of society over time, right? So,
If I may interrupt
yeah,
you just for a second,
yeah.
that is precisely how Gen Z think about older generations, where it's like, we don't need to explain tech to you, just give it to us, let us take care of it. And this is what I mean. There's a fundamental disconnect. And there's so many parallels between Gen Z and policymakers where we we don't really understand the tech, but we still have to craft narratives and solutions to take it forward.
And deal with it in your daily lives at work and all
Precisely.
that stuff, right?
Sorry,
So,
sorry to interrupt.
so my basics, I'm an engineer by training, and I spend a lot of times on systems engineering, including on my submarine, because every piping system, every electrical system, we had to memorize, every valve, every cross connect. So I'm a big believer in systems engineering, and every system has inputs and outputs. And as I mentioned already, and a generative AI system is the same, and it's only got three inputs. It's got a model, a large language model, or a multimodal model. There's videos in there, whatever. And it's got compute power from cloud computing these days, mainly, and both of those are commoditized. And then it's got training data as a third input. Its outputs, because it's such a powerful system and because it can do videos or uh, um, audio or written text, because it's got a memory a million times bigger than Einstein's brain. The number of outputs of this system are really kind of uh, hard to fathom, the numbers of outputs. And so we wanted to focus on training data transparency as a leverage point on the inputs for regulation and transparency, because you have more power, you can put guardrails in place around that input that has more downstream impact on a whole lot of outputs, if you will. There still should be outputs regulated. There still should be deep fakes regulated. There still should be, you know, lawsuits against people that are stealing Scarlett Johansson's voice without her permission. All of those things, right? Um, but copyright, book writers, that sort of thing. But we decided to focus on shining a light on training data in terms of transparency as a focus area, because we think it's got a lot of downstream impact on a lot of things. And it starts with the third one, the third of those five you listed off, um, sort of a data label of transparency. What's easier to understand is it's like a nutrition label on a cereal box. Okay, so if you think about that, the nutrition label on the cereal box, whether you like Cheerios or Captain Crunch, or some really nice, muesli. I don't know what. The nutrition label doesn't tell you how to make the cereal. It's not a recipe. It's just the ingredients at a very high level. So our nutrition label for AI is there personal information in there, right? Was it opted in, or did you take it? Is there copyrighted information in there? Is it licensed information, or did you take it? Is there other IP in there? And is their chat room information in there. Okay. And the reason we care about those things is again, because first of all, if every company that was building models was required to disclose if they were using personal information in their models, people would very quickly be asking, why do you need personal information? Do you have any good reason for it? And I think 95 to 98% of foundational model owners would start filtering it out because they wouldn't want to take the the legal exposure of sucking all that private information in, right? There's 17 states that have privacy laws today, and most of them are being run over roughshod in a lot of ways. Okay. And the problem is there's so little data transparency that the attorneys general's offices or the organizations that have the requirement to enforce these laws don't begin to have enough discovery information to even bring a basic lawsuit against it, right? Because the tech organization, the big tech companies are fighting tooth and nail to not have any transparency. That should tell you something, right? I don't want to tell you anything about what's going in my model. Nothing. Um, just another document, an example. So one is opt-in for personal information, right? Another one is that if you're using copyrighted information, you should be disclosing that and licensing it. Why would that matter? Well, if in the business I ran, we had data licensing to be one of the inputs along with the chargeback information that went into our predictive AI models, our machine learning models. And data licensing in that business was by far our biggest expense line, besides headcount. Okay, it was 5x our compute power. So for Sam Altman to argue that you can't pay for copyrighted information because he's just got too much cost structure, that's just not true. That's never happened in the history of technology. I live a mile from the University of Washington, and um, there are tomes of books at the University of Washington Law School around copyright and IP information and licensing. This is 150 years of settled law, and somehow it doesn't apply to generative AI. That's just not true. But if you did have to disclose it and it was licensed, what would happen is you would have to pay more for it because otherwise you'd open yourself up to a bunch of lawsuits. And if you paid more for it, what would happen is you wouldn't take this much data, you would take this much data and you would curate it carefully. Okay. So we're a big believer in strategically in what we call focused models. The industry tends to call them small models. I think that's doing it a disservice, but a focused model or a small model is doing something that's very specific to solve a problem we really want solved. Like we really want to use the training data that's been licensed or we have access to through the people that are participating in the study to be able to use images for various stages of pancreatic cancer so that the generative AI system recognizes an image that it with high precision that this is stage 4 pancreatic cancer. That's a specific problem with a specific set of training data, right? And it's not sucking in something that would tell a girl she should be okay with sexual exploitation at age 13, right? So that would be the example of a focus model. And if you had training data costs and a cost structure, you would curate your training data, you would test it before you put it in your model, and you would know much better because it's narrower how that training data impacts your outputs. And so those are some of the benefits of training data transparency. It protects copyright and IP holders, it protects citizens on their personal information much more, and it has downstream impact because it narrows model focus to real business problems, and the training data that has to be licensed is highly curated and tested to be able to focus on those types of problems.
So obviously you are not naive. You are totally cognizant of how the social media, how big tech has fought tooth and nail against social media regulation. And so the exact same thing is happening now with AI regulation. How are you preparing to fight against big tech or to bring the fight to big tech, if that's even part of the strategy? Because the next question I want to set up is what does a post-transparency coalition world look like in the age of AI? But before that, when we are talking to staffers and policymakers, and when we are getting these things implemented, this is not going to be a smooth road, unfortunately. There is going to be a lot
No,
of, so
no.
how do we deal with this? How do we prepare?
Well, you know,
And
first
also,
of all,
just before, if you
yep.
don't want to say that, to not put the battle plan on the internet, I
No,
totally
no,
understand and we can
I
move
can
on.
talk about things at a high level, and
Okay.
that the you know, we first of all, we are putting safety and protection of our citizens first. And I think that gets lost in the debate, even at the policymaker level. A lot of times you hear about, well, we're gonna either stifle innovation or we got to have it wide open for innovation. Well, let's talk about protecting citizens because they got lost in the social media debates. Okay, in terms of should it be regulated, should there be policy or not? And so we're taking as citizens, as protect citizens as a first priority, right? And so if you start there, an awful lot of arguments that come up of why things shouldn't be regulated seem to not be as relevant. So that's just at a very basic strategic level. Number two is we're not trying to stifle, we're not trying to shut down innovation. We're definitely not trying to put Gen AI back in a bottle. We're asking for a nutrition label, like on a cereal box, for your training data inputs of the most what the Google CEO calls perhaps the most what is it profound technology since fire in terms of its impact on humanity. It doesn't seem that that's such a hard thing to ask for, nutrition label like a cereal box for something that's more profound than fire. Like that, it doesn't seem like where, boy, that's a really big ask. And so when we talk to lawmakers and staffers, we remind them of that. We're not here like trying to write some, you know, 400-page book of licensing requirements or something like that. We're talking about basics of this. The bills we're supporting are a handful of pages, if that. Okay, so that's number two. Is we're trying to take a very straightforward approach that we believe that anybody that sort of kind of follows this stuff would say that seems like a very not a high bar or a big ask. Third is we're definitely focusing both at the state and the federal level. And we spent a lot of time on our state strategy. And in 2024, we only operated in Washington, California. We want to branch out to 8 to 10 states in 2025 in the 2025 legislation that starts in January. The states move faster than the federal government. And they also iterate on their laws more. So once a law gets passed, it tends to the next year they tend to tighten down the law or say, oh, there was this gap we found, or they make improvements on it. Whereas the federal government, they pass some broad sweeping law in the Congress, and it's so hard to do it, it doesn't come up again for a long time. And so an example for your listeners is um, the 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 primary federal regulation that or lack of regulation that social media companies operate under is called Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act. Okay. The Telecommunications Act of 1996. So probably more than half of the people listening in here today were born after that was passed. All right. Which is scary in and of itself. So we're operating under a sweeping federal regulation in 1996 before the internet was like there wasn't even a real Netscape went public in 1996, and most of your listeners won't remember Netscape, but Netscape was the first browser that was really powerful, and then Microsoft made Internet Explorer and wiped out Netscape so that their monopoly wasn't impacted and so forth. So so uh, this is a law that's been around since 1996. It hasn't been updated. And that Section 230 basically says, in kind of my own terms here, and I'm not a lawyer, is basically if you're if you're an internet if you post things, if you allow, you created an infrastructure so that people can post things on the internet, you're not responsible for what they post. That's effectively what Section 230 does. So it takes away any accountability or responsibility of companies like social media companies that allow individuals or organizations to post stuff. Whereas if you're a publisher, you get fact checked. Okay. So the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or ABC or Fox News all get fact checked, okay, and are subject to libel laws and so forth based on what they publish. They can't publish things that are totally outlandish. They can't libel a person over and over again. Okay. But that can happen on social media because Section 230 gives them a blank check to have no accountability for what's posted up there. And now what you have is all sorts of crap on there that is completely unregulated, all sorts of conspiracy theories, all sorts of child pornography, really bad stuff going on, and no accountability. And that's from something that was passed 1996 in 1996. And no one really had this idea of all these unintended consequences 28 years on, right? But back to your original question, we like state level legislation. We are also working at the federal level, and we've probably briefed 25, almost all staffers, one senator I briefed really quickly, but almost all staffers because they do the bill writing and so forth um, at the federal level because there's a number of AI laws. It's just really unclear, especially with the election coming up, whether anything will get passed this fall. But federal legislation has so much more impact than state legislation broadly. So you kind of, if you're gonna uh, you don't want to miss one of those, I guess is what I would say, right? And again, we're focused on all of the things at the federal level are very broad, and we get approached or asked for input or to read over just the section on training data. We're not trying to like write some broad federal law. We got to stick to our knitting and our focus area.
What is the biggest disconnect when it comes to getting staffers and policymakers to understand the bill or understand the legislation? Is it just because this is the same thing that happened with like cryptocurrency, where there was just so much complexity and so much jargon and so much, you know, you know, um, like the technical aspect was just very intimidating. Is it
Yeah,
the same thing for AI? And
I don't think so. The thing that's challenging with cryptocurrency is it's a financial thing. So it falls under a bunch of different um, agencies, including the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. You know, it falls under banking laws or not, depending on if banks are using. It follows fall it. Does the Federal Reserve have say over it or not? Because it's not. And if you're operating a crypto company, you're not headquartered in the U.S. You're still subject to laws, but it's so easy for people to wire accounts, to create an account in the Cayman Islands, wire money there, and then operate outside. So it has a lot of different, because it's in financial services, a lot of different overlapping jurisdictions and so forth that make it super complicated. And I'm no expert on crypto by a long way. I just stay away from it because it's completely unregulated. And whenever you have money flows globally with complete zero regulation, you have Sam Bankman-Fried's. It's like the bar in Star Wars, man. There's 20 dudes with the big hair like Sam Bankman-Fried coming to rip everybody off. And so I just stay away from it because I just can't keep up with it all. But I think generative AI is different than that because it doesn't run into all of those jurisdictions. When we started this, my partner Jay and I thought that one of our really big efforts would be just to convince some policymakers to do something, right? Just don't let it be social media again. Do something, right? That has not been required, broadly stated. That has been, there is a, uh, uh, policymakers, both at the state and federal level, are predisposed to do something here because they have taken to heart those lessons of social media. They don't trust Mark Zuckerberg, okay, and his company. And and there is nothing that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta has done to earn any trust, by the way. They've just completely operated in their own interest. If you look at the whistleblower testimony to Congress, if you look at two different Wall Street Journal deep dives, one on pedophile hashtags that everybody knew was going on, and Meta ignored it until they got called out on it. Even though like TikTok didn't have the same pedophile, hashtag structure and stuff like that. Um, Over and over again. So I think there's a very much a predisposition at the policymaker level to say we need laws, enforceable laws in place, not hoping that these tech titans do the right thing. And this shouldn't be a surprise. If you look at financial services has had all sorts of regulation and laws in place, put in place over the last 200 years, because every place there isn't some law or regulation, you have some person committing a massive amount of fraud. And Sam Bankman-Fried can get in line because there's thousands of him over 2 centuries, right? And so if you have a place like tech that has become, you know, pervasive in all of our lives in a lot of ways, it should be regulated far more than it is, because it's probably 1% as regulated as financial services. And that's mainly like in areas like healthcare, for instance, things like that.
This is one of the last questions, but it is a little bit more abstract. So we are seeing major players like China um, start influencing the, like, I guess, AI infosphere, if we can call it that. How do we deal with like geopolitical game theory? Because obviously the laws and regulations we apply, hopefully, in the United States, it's very unlikely, and as a matter of fact, it might be foolish to assume that China would adhere to those. So are these things on your mind, or how do we, I guess it's an open question, how do we deal with that, the China quote unquote problem with AI?
Yeah. We spend more money on defense than everybody else in the world. I was part of that defense establishment as a young submarine officer. And um, we should absolutely rely on our diplomatic corps and our Department of Defense to do their job in this area, not have tech companies think that use it as a scare tactic for not regulating our own, and protecting our own citizens.
Mm.
At a basic level, we just forced a TikTok sale, right? In less than a year, the U.S. Congress forced a TikTok sale to separate it from its Chinese parent company because of all the private information that was being funneled over to China. I think that was a good move. And probably your listeners don't know it, but many countries in the world completely control their internet access, so you can't get into them. Starting with China, so we can do more to protect our own, in the West, in our allies, whether it's in Asia, Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, Philippines, whether it's NATO, South America. We have a lot of allies around the world that we can begin to limit internet access if we wanted to countries like China and bad actors and Russia. Okay, and there's a lot of effort to do that. But to believe that somehow we shouldn't put regulations in place to protect U.S. citizens and to have basic guardrails on the concentration of power in big tech because China might get us. That's an absurd argument to me, and it's just trying to avoid any regulation and accountability, and we need that for our citizens.
Who are you doing this for? Is it like
Yeah.
why, first of all, why now? Why in this in this accelerationist view? And what is the end goal? Who are you trying to protect?
the reason I started doing this, I really wanted to write a book, honestly. And in fact, I would read about 25,000 pages of a book, 25,000, sorry, words of a book,
I was
which
gonna
is
say it's a
kind
big
of,
book.
yeah, yeah, I said that would be a really big book. 25,000 words, kind of a quarter of what I needed to write, I felt like, a third to a quarter. Um, I sleep pretty well at night generally, and I've been in situations like I've known what it is to be scared. I've seen I've been in a couple of different fires 500 feet below the surface of the ocean, and your training takes over, but there's fear, right? You just get over it. We had flooding at 900 feet one time, and you can't imagine the pressure on a hull, 900 feet, a little 1 inch pipe broke loose, and the amount of water that got inside the ship in just a fraction of just like a minute or less before we secured that thing. You just you can't imagine how much water came in. And so I've seen scary things. I've known fear. Um, but I sleep well at night. I've had to shut down two companies, lay off all the staff. I've had real ups and downs as a CEO. So I've had very challenging times professionally. But in general, I sleep well at night. And last summer, I wasn't sleeping. And I was concerned about my kids and their generation, not me. Full disclosure, I'm 57 years old. At some level, I'm a write-off. You know what I mean? Yeah, and so, uh, me, I'm at peace. I've got three kids. I've been able to, live in a country and grow up here and be educated here and be part of civil society in a whole bunch of ways. And it was able to serve my country, was able to work as a business person. And I just wanted to give something back. And I was concerned about your generation, not mine, and where Gen AI would go if we didn't begin to regulate tech companies for the benefit of citizens, not just for their own willingness to do whatever they want.
You've lived a very full life. You've seen a lot of things and you're doing a lot of things. Let's turn away from Gen AI and just focus on Gen Z for a final question. What advice do you have for Generation Z, given that they are the digital natives? They are kind of the Gen AI natives in a way, along with Gen Alpha. They will be existing with these technologies for the foreseeable future, good, bad, ugly. How should they reorient their mindsets to think, to act, and to behave in a more grounded and more successful manner?
Boy, I'll just say two things. One is I think everybody would do better with less screen time. And so to the extent everybody can get outside for a walk once a day, to the extent that they can hike or walk their dog or just enjoy the outdoors and the air and appreciate the fact that we take good care of our environment and want to take better care of our environment and all of those things. And when I say we take good care of our environment, yes, we've got global warming, but if you look back to when I was a kid, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was founded in 1970 in the Nixon administration. And at that time, I happened to know Bill Ruckelshaus was the first. I was lucky enough to have him on one of my boards, and he was a mentor of mine and a wonderful man who was the first director of the Environmental Protection Agency. And he talked about back in 1970, you didn't have to ask people why we would need an EPA. You could taste it in the air you breathe. You could see there was litter all up and down every expressway. People just threw stuff out the windows. There was the Cuyahoga, I'm not pronouncing it wrong, river in Cleveland caught on fire and burned for days because of this oil slime on top of it. I'm from the Great Lakes area, and the Great Lakes were just so much dirtier back then than now. So I live in a country where we take care of the outdoors more than many countries do. And I would encourage all of your generation to just enjoy some of that and less screen time. That's number one. Number two is I'm a reader of books, and that may sound really old school. I don't care if you read it online. I think it's better to have a physical book because then you just don't have some electronic in front of you. but books have more depth than, videos and quick and all of us have been trained by social media and other things to have shorter and shorter attention spans. And so reading a book, whether it's a fiction book or a nonfiction book, I like reading historical fiction, I like reading history. But like, or whether it's a business book or whatever, it both gets you away from this short-term, immediate, feedback loop of needing something in front of you all the time. And it lengthens your concentration span. And I think all of us would do better to retrain, and it's literally a retraining effort to concentrate longer without things pinging at you. And so those are just two thoughts.
Are there any couple of books that have made a significant impact on your life? Regardless of what they are.
Uh, yeah, sure. I'll give you one. One's called, oh gosh, Let It Go. And hold on just a minute. Uh, and it's just about, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's just really about not holding it in feelings inside you, but sort of being okay. Uh, um, One of my employees gave it to me. And if you hold a lot of bitterness or frustration inside you, whether it's about work or whether it's about home or whatever, and you don't let it out, it tends to come out in bad ways. But let it go is kind of about being okay with feeling something, but just kind of then turning it loose. And I hope that I've got the name right. And then there's a business book I recommend on negotiation that's really about life more than business. It's called Getting More. And it's really kind of, and it's not about getting, and the point is not trying to get more stuff all the time. That's not the point of the book at all. The point of the book is more that you're not trying to get everything in a negotiation. And whether it's a negotiation with your family or your partner or with your at work with your colleagues or in some sport you play or whatever, you have to live almost all the time, 98% of the time, anybody you negotiate with you have to live with them afterwards. And so you're not trying, so negotiation shouldn't be a zero-sum game of I won and you lost. It should be very much more, we both got something out of that. We probably neither of us got exactly what we wanted, but I wasn't so daft as to take everything from you and burn a bridge with you, Ayush, because I'm going to have to live and work with you at some time in the future. And in this day and age of anger and um, uh, uh, negative politics, and you're either with us or against us, and we're not willing to compromise. I'm a believer in compromise. I think all of your listeners know that whether it's with their families or their work, you got to compromise to get through the day. And just at some level, like how can we run a country if our elected officials aren't willing to compromise on things? And so anyway, that's another book.
Rob, this has been a bloody fantastic episode. How do we support you online? How can Gen Z
Well, just
make a difference?
we have a website, transparencycoalition.ai. And we have a news section of that website that we curate on what's going on. That's not like what I call the Sam Altman victory tour of all this. Oh, yeah, it's going to be a gold rush. No, it's like all of the things that like people should probably know about generative AI that's going on out there, and about a third of it we write ourselves with our small editorial staff, and about two-thirds of it is stuff we take from, we see going on in the news, but it's all there in one place. And so be knowledgeable about, and have pause and be curious about things that are not going well in generative AI, because it's going to affect you all, and you should have a lot of skepticism towards it, honestly. So that's one way to help. And then, encourage your local elected officials, vote for people that are open to um, uh, putting some guardrails in place and think it's important to do so. And I hope in the future we will get to a point where we take donations directly. We're just not at that point yet. And so, that's some starters.
Normalize our local officials being tech savvy. That's the main thing.